Wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GBNews.
We're live in Glasgow for another week of COP, but it's not just COP that's going on, there's a lot else too. And this programme, we're not just going to be discussing what's going on here in Glasgow, but also the contentious debate in Parliament later on about lobbying, about standards. Will the Speaker make a significant intervention? The debate has been brought by the Lib Dem Chief Whip. There's lots to discuss about that. We'll too be taking to the streets of Glasgow and talking to the people who were protesting here over the weekend. And also, of course, COVID. Cases are tumbling, but the media continues to ignore it. We'll bring you a COVID corrective. All here in the next half an hour on The Briefing after your news.
Well, good morning. I'm Rosie Wright. This is your news at 9 o'clock. MPs will hold an emergency debate on parliamentary standards later, following accusations of corruption. Well, that's as the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, faces calls for a public inquiry into allegations of Tory sleaze. Last week, the government did a U-turn after a vote was passed to overhaul its misconduct system, blocking the suspension of the MP Owen Paterson for breaching lobbying rules. The Shadow Child Poverty Secretary, Wes Streeting, told us that a public inquiry and an official apology is needed.
I think we need an inquiry about how that contract was awarded, because it seems there was no tender process, no competition. So I think we need to know that it was above board and that taxpayers' money was well spent. He needs to call off the attack dogs who've been sent out to attack the House of Commons Standards Commissioner, and make it clear that the Standards Commissioner will have the full backing of the government to pursue MPs without fear or favour, to make sure we're upholding basic standards of decency in public life. And it's about time Boris Johnson himself apologised, because at the end of the day, the fish rots from the head. And these kinds of grubby standards are the standards set by Boris Johnson in Number 10, and it's just not acceptable.
Police in Northern Ireland are appealing for witnesses after a man was shot in his home in Antrim. He was taken to hospital after being hit in the chest. Meanwhile, a bus has been hijacked on a Loyalist estate outside of Belfast. 4 masked men boarded the double-decker bus and ordered the driver and passengers off before setting it alight. Last week, another bus was hijacked and burnt down in County Down in an apparent protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. UK travellers can now fly to the United States for the first time in nearly 2 years. The US has opened its borders to fully vaccinated visitors who must also take a COVID test within 3 days of arrival. Children need to be tested 3 to 5 days later. Airlines are now increasing their schedules to meet growing demand. A British man killed in a shark attack off Western Australia has been described as a wonderful father. 57-year-old Paul Millerchip was swimming at Port Beach near Perth when the alarm was raised. During a search for his body, police recovered a pair of goggles. His wife, who doesn't want to be named, said he died doing what he loved.
Rest in peace, Paul. He died what he enjoyed doing the most, which was exercising. He was a wonderful man, a wonderful father, and he loved his exercise.
Twitter Twitter users will be expecting Elon Musk to make good his promise to sell 10% of his Tesla shares following an online poll. Well, 3.5 million people voted. 58% said he should dispose of the stock worth around £16 billion to pay tax bills. Musk said he'll abide by the results whichever way they go. Marks & Spencer have introduced pronoun-inclusive name badges for staff. The idea, which came from an employee, means workers can now wear whichever combination of pronouns they choose. The supermarket chain says the initiative is a simple yet impactful way to make sure that LGBTQ+ identities are respected. You are up to date. I'll be back with your headlines in half an hour. For now, back to Glasgow with the briefing and Tom.
Well, Glasgow is hosting COP26, the enormous environmental conference. Later today, President Obama is going to address all of the delegates, talking about how young people can be involved in the change for the future, about what needs to change in the future. But some people are just not happy with what's going on inside COP26. Indeed, there were 2 protests that marched through Glasgow this weekend. And I caught up with the protesters to see exactly what they were doing. We're here at the COP protest, that's right, protesting the climate change conference. Quite clearly, everyone behind me marching up and down here is absolutely fuming that world leaders are coming together to try and get something done to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. Let's talk to some of them.
If we don't start facing it out now, we will go extinct. And
Humans will go extinct?
Yeah, of course.
Should everyone be like Cuba?
I think it's a very good example of the way we can use socialism to be sustainable.
Its CO2 emissions are minuscule anyway, so...
Is that because no one can afford a car?
Partly.
Is it Scotland's oil?
Yes, it's off our shores. It should be Scotland's oil, but unfortunately it was taken over by the UK government.
So Scotland should have been drilling that oil instead?
Oh yes,
Denial and delay. Who's denying climate change?
There's still quite a lot of people that don't think it's full. I mean, Boris Johnson wasn't...
Boris Johnson's denying climate change? Excuse me, is this a protest in support of COP or against COP?
I'm neither for or against it, I suppose.
Nuclear power, yes or no?
No.
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 No. Dunno. No.
Not needed.
Why would you even think of nuclear power? Are we for or against nuclear power?
Against.
Again.
We support nuclear power. I think it's important.
I think definitely that 2050 is way too late.
Why do you know better than the UN?
Well, I don't know better. Science know better.
But the UN is scientists. The IPCC says 2050 for net zero and 2030 for halving. Why are they wrong?
Yeah, but...
I've got to say, for a march that was advertised as 100,000 strong, it doesn't look particularly busy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Palestinian flags. Why have you brought a big Palestinian flag to a climate conference?
Oh yes, one of the main mottos is climate justice, right? But and I agree with that. But let's not forget human justice.
So very green. Your sign says only world socialist revolution can end climate change. Which socialist countries have been particularly good on climate in the past?
The early Soviet Union was quite good on climate. I suggest it's something you look at. But
what about the Aral Sea?
What happened in the Soviet Union was something which I don't call socialism. That's partly because socialism doesn't work in one country.
It wouldn't be a climate protest without gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Who's going extinct?
We all are. That's the danger.
The danger is humanity could go extinct.
Yeah, but the
global warming has clearly got so bad that climate activists are having to huddle together like penguins just to stay away from the cold. What is your message?
Please do something.
You don't think anything's being done at the moment?
Well, I don't think enough. What do you think?
90% of the world's economy has signed up to net zero in the last week. Sounds like quite a lot's being done.
Well, yeah, but...
What are you hoping world leaders take from that sign?
capitalism is not going to solve the problem of climate change, basically.
Which socialist countries have done better than capitalist countries?
There haven't really been any socialist countries, have there? Could name me one.
There are lots that have tried it.
Yeah, but they tried it, but the flaming Yanks came in and stopped it, didn't they?
Maybe that suggests something inherent within the system.
Yeah, exactly.
I accept that socialism hasn't come about in the way that I would like to have seen it.
What would you like to see?
Actions, not words.
Which actions specifically?
We'd love to see the people who say they want to save our planet actually putting that into action.
Which actions specifically?
We'd love to see the people who say they want to save our planet.
Fish on a bin. We're here at a climate change rally. The UK's cut carbon emissions by 45% in the last 30 years, more than any G20 country. Surely that's sort of a path to progress.
Most of the cut in our carbon emissions is because we've offset, we've offshored it.
That accounts for about 5%.
Right, okay. I mean, I'd be very surprised.
You need to bring energy under public ownership, under democratic public ownership.
Politicians setting how energy is generated is going to be more green?
Absolutely not. That's why I'm in favour of workers controlling industry, not politicians.
How do workers control something if they're not politicians?
If you look at Are
you encouraged by anything you've seen at COP this week?
COP does seem to be mostly a greenwash situation here. I'm encouraged by this. I'm encouraged by the visceral expression of hope and resistance by people.
You're more encouraged by people out here in this field today holding banners and signs than by 90% of the world's economies signing up to net zero by the middle of this century.
Those figures are not satisfactory.
This was advertised as a 100,000 person march, a huge event, an enormous stage, throngs of people. Something tells me it's not quite 100,000 people here. There's blue smoke coming out of the horn of what I assume is a unicorn. I don't quite understand it either, but that really reflects what's going on here today at this protest. I think it's a bit of a mix. It's a carbon unicorn.
It's supposed to represent the carbon markets because carbon markets are a false solution.
Is this funded by the US Republican Party? Because they're against carbon markets as well.
No, it's not.
So carbon markets, one of the proposed solutions in terms of reducing CO2, you're utterly against it.
Carbon markets are not about reducing CO2, it's about getting net zero. They have to plant forests and trees, and then it gets them to net zero, which is not how we want.
So you're against net zero?
We are against net zero because what we want is to address the root cause. The root cause is the emission.
If all 196 countries represented at COP26 signed up to net zero tomorrow, that wouldn't be enough for you?
That would be a failure for us because net zero is not the real solution. It's a false solution. I don't know why you keep pushing this, but it's not the right thing.
But the IPCC, the climate supremos at the UN, say that even if we just half our carbon emissions by 2030, we can keep warming to 1.5 degrees. Even that for you is not enough.
It is not enough.
The curiosity here, the curious thing, is that there are ecological and environmental protesters protesting the conference of their dreams. It's unimaginable 10 years ago that you'd have all of these countries committing to eliminating carbon from their economies on a net basis. It's unimaginable that we would have heard these pledges and all this cash going to developing countries to get ready for a net zero transition. It's unimaginable that the leaders of the biggest businesses in the world would be getting on board with that net zero agenda too. All of that's been happening down the road, and yet the people here at this protest are not happy. It makes you wonder, will they ever be happy? It makes you wonder, at what point will enough be enough? It's a curious point, but you know what? There's one more week of COP to go. Will there be a big agreement by Friday? Will there be a new seismic Paris-style agreement of all of the nations at COP, the 196 UN member states, those countries of the world? Will there be one new big agreement in terms of changing the way that we live, regulating more businesses, potentially fining businesses that do not meet net zero commitments? There's a hell of a lot going on. You'd think it would be the dream of the people here protesting, but something tells me that the people here today just love protesting too much.
Well, there we have it, the voices from the streets of Glasgow. And I have to say, walking around those protests, there was more than a little bit of rubbish left in their wake. Ironic, perhaps, for environmental protesters. Well, rubbish is something that has been a problem for Glasgow in the last few weeks, as has transport, as has housing. It's a tough task to host a huge international event like COP26, the largest conference ever hosted in the UK. Well, one man who knows exactly the trials and tribulations that COP has been through and that Glasgow has been through is Glasgow councillor Thomas Kerr, who I'm delighted to say can join me on the show now. Now, we've heard a lot about problems about bins, about problems about transport, indeed problems about housing. Has anything got better since the start of COP?
No, to be honest with you, after our conversation a couple of weeks ago, things have just stayed basically the same, only we've got a strike added on top of that, and a council leader who, you know, marches saying that we're pro-environment while walking past piles of rubbish ourselves, so it's not got better at all. In fact, the people of Glasgow have been very let down by the fact that this council's just not ran it properly.
How have they not run it properly? What could they have done to try and make sure that the streets were cleaner?
They should have got investment into the front line in Glasgow. We need investment in this city. Years and years of local government budgets being cut has resulted in this situation. They should have also negotiated with the unions. You know, we've had a massive strike this week. The fly tipping and overflowing bins has been horrendous in Glasgow as it is, but it's been even worse this week because of that. So they could have negotiated with the unions, made sure they had an acceptable pay offer to then try and make sure we can get moving forward. But that's not been the case at all here, and instead Glasgow's been let down.
Have you got the impression that world leaders, that dignitaries and delegates who've all come here have got the best that Glasgow has had to offer?
I think most of them have, because a lot of the places down at the SEC and at the different zones that are going on does look nice and clean, because the council has made sure they prioritised that. The difference is most of the Glaswegians who are walking about there now haven't been able to see that. Instead, what they've had is, you know, transportation issues. I had to come in a taxi this morning because I couldn't get public transport because of how bad it is to come into an environment conference. That's the kind of issues that we're facing here in Glasgow for ordinary Glaswegians. So most delegates won't have been seeing any of this stuff, but most Glaswegians are.
So really, this is a tale of two Glasgows. What we're seeing is that people who've come in perhaps fancy jets, private jets, convoys of cars, they're all fine. But for the ordinary people here, they've had a really tough time of this conference.
Yeah, nothing has changed at all. You know, they've managed to clear up the streets for Joe Biden flying in, but then when the leader of the council's marching through the streets on Saturday, we're seeing fly tipping yet again right in front of the march that's going right past. That's the scenes that we're now seeing in Glasgow. It is a tale of two cities, and it's because of how Glasgow City Council and the Scottish Government have both been able to organise this conference. It's made sure that the SEC's been nice and clean, while places where I stay in the East End of Glasgow just looks the exact same as always.
It's interesting when we talk about big events like this, we often talk about the Olympics and the legacy that they leave. Will COP leave a legacy for Glasgow, and will it be an important one? Will it be a positive one?
I think in terms of the conference, it will leave some sort of legacy. People know about climate change. They're really, really keen to take climate action. I was at an event last week with school children, and it was really inspirational. I signed a children's charter here in Glasgow to try and make sure that we tackle climate change. I think that legacy is still going to exist. The difference is the investment that we've seen in terms of frontline services down at the SEC, we now need to see rolled out right through Glasgow, so then ordinary people can get the benefits of what Joe Biden and other world leaders managed to get when they came here.
Now, I've seen how clogged the roads have been, I've seen the traffic problems, I've seen a little bit of those public transport problems as well. At what point can we see those issues finally being solved, or is this just an intractable problem?
It's just an issue that Glasgow's faced for years. You know, delegates, this again goes back to the tale of two cities kind of thing. Delegates can get free bus travel, delegates can get free travel passes and things like that. This is stuff we've been arguing for in Glasgow for years. The Oyster card system that you have in London, we don't have that in Glasgow. We don't have anything like that that resembles it at all. Yet delegates can get it for free. So we need to make sure that these kind of things that came into place, the Scottish Government then gives Glasgow City Council the power to make sure that that happens right throughout.
And just finally here, we're looking at the broader political context of Scotland. There's been some criticism of the SNP in recent months, of the Greens seemingly U-turning on a number of issues in the Scottish Parliament. How stable do you think this Scottish Government is as a whole, and what can we look forward to in the next few years in the run-up? I know it's 4 years away, but the next Scottish election.
Well, it's completely shambolic. You know, we've now got a Green Party who's in government that's arguing with Greenpeace while sticking up for Nicola Sturgeon, where Nicola Sturgeon's silent. That's the situation we have in Scotland. This is not a stable government. This is a government that's got extremists in it with the Greens and who are not actually focusing on the day-to-day issues. So I think for the next 4 years, ordinary Glaswegians, ordinary people in Scotland, working class communities who have been left behind by the SNP will start to look at the Conservatives as the real alternative to try and build that different Scottish government and that different kind of Scotland.
Well, Thomas Carr, Glasgow councillor for the Scottish Conservatives, thank you so much for joining me here on the briefing this morning. Really interesting conversation to see what's going on for ordinary people in Glasgow, as well as the dignitaries, as well as those who can afford the private jets. Well, elsewhere at the weekend, there was, of course, this big protest, although probably not as big as many were hoping. One person who I caught up with at that protest was the Shadow Business Secretary, Ed Miliband. Here's what he had to say. Are you protesting COP here today?
I'm not exactly protesting COP. I'm talking to all of the young people and others who are here making their voice heard. I think it's incredibly important to hear their voice. And, there's always a thing with these international meetings that they tend to be quite restricted and exclusive. And I don't think we'd have seen the progress we've seen if it hadn't been for the voice of civil society demanding action. And I think it's important that they're here doing that.
Do you think this is an organisation, an audience that recognises there has been progress?
I think some people do and some people don't. But I think that two things can be true at once. One is progress has been made, and the second is it's wholly insufficient to the scale of the emergency we face. And so I think what I hear from some people here is that, yes, there's been progress, and yes, I feel things are a bit better, but at the same time, 2030 is what matters, and we're not moving fast enough. And I think that is probably right. That's probably a fair summary.
One thing I've been asking people here today is whether or not they support nuclear power on our pathway to net zero. Where does the Labour Party stand on that?
We support nuclear power. I think it's important to have new nuclear as a supporting role for, if you look at what the Climate Change Committee says, it says about 80% of our power can come from renewables, but nuclear has an important supporting role. New nuclear has an important supporting role. And so for some people that's difficult because some people have had a long-standing anti-nuclear power position, but I think it's got an important supporting role.
And do you think the climate movement is moving towards nuclear power?
I think some parts of the climate movement are moving towards it and some parts aren't. And some people want it all done by renewables. But I think, my view is you need all the power sources at your disposal. If the problem is so great and so urgent that you can't afford to reject any of the sources at our disposal.
It was interesting, I was speaking to someone earlier asking them which G20 country they thought had done the best in terms of reducing emissions. They said Germany, which of course is a country that closed its nuclear power stations and its CO2 stopped going down for a decade as a result. Actually, in the G20, the country that's reduced its CO2 emissions by the largest amount in the last 30 years is the UK. Do you think people know that?
I think some people know that, but I think we should be proud of lots of the things that we've done, and our targets are very competitive in terms of internationally. I think there's a question about delivery on the targets in the coming decade, and I think it's against a background where no G20 country is doing enough. And I think it's quite, look, China is not doing enough, and we need to push China to do more. But I think it's also right to acknowledge that every major country should be going further and faster. Even the target to halve emissions this decade, which we're a long way off from, only gives us I'm not trying to depress you, but only gives us a 50-50 chance of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. That is the scale, we've left it all far too late, and that's the scale of the change that we need.
Shadow Energy and Business Secretary there, Ed Miliband, who I caught up with a day or two ago. Now, it's not just COP26 that's going on. Of course, the world of real politics back in Westminster chugs on as well. And the government's got itself into a bit of a scandal. This morning, the papers are not all full of COP. They're full of issues over lobbying. And there's an emergency debate this afternoon after ministerial statements in the House of Commons brought forward by the Lib Dems chief whip. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, will be speaking in that debate and has laid down 3 challenges for the Conservative Party. He wants the Conservative Party to make sure that it never makes Owen Paterson a Lord. He wants the Conservative Party to formally expel the disgraced MP Rob Roberts. and he wants a proper inquiry into the lobbying that Owen Paterson was doing. Well, let's talk over all of that that's going on in the House of Commons now with someone who's been following these issues incredibly closely. Christian Calgi is the senior reporter for the Guido Fawkes website, and I'm delighted to say can join me now. Christian, welcome to the programme. Are the Tories in trouble?
Morning. Yes, I think so. Yesterday we had the Environment Secretary George Eustice claiming that this was a storm in a Westminster teacup, and I think as the yet another day of front pages emerged completely splashed all over with the Owen Paterson scandal, rather than what they want to be talking about, which is COP. It suggests that it's anything but that, and maybe cutting through. As you say, there's going to be a debate later on. I don't think we know who is going to be responding to that. I shy away from making any sort of Lib Dem eating my hat predictions about Boris, but it'll probably be a Cabinet Office junior minister. And the opposition parties are going to go hell for leather on this issue. It really has united large swathes of the House, and I would be unsurprised if we have more than a few Tory MPs basically telling their whips, who are presumably desperately asking around for some supportive voices, telling them where to go, because they are far from happy at this point.
Of course, and these are the same Conservative MPs who were told what to do by their whips last week, only for then the Conservative Party policy to spin on a dime and all of that loyalty and that support to have been for nothing. How much here have the Conservative Party shot themselves in the foot? Of course, if they hadn't attempted this manoeuvre to sort of retrospectively assess what had gone on with the Standards Committee, this wouldn't have been the big story that it's become, would it?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, no one in the wider public would know the name Owen Paterson. No one would know his supposed wrongdoings. And yes, he would have taken a 30-day suspension. But I would be very surprised if the very Tory constituency of North Shropshire would have voted for a by-election in those circumstances. This has been a massive, massive own goal, not just for the wider Tory party, but especially the whipping operation. The briefings towards the end of last week against the Chief Whip, Mark Spencer, were nothing short of ferocious. And a lot of MPs were pointing out to me that the wider problem here for the whipping operation, is you are meant to trust the Chief Whip's judgment. If you're being told how to vote on certain issues, you better be damn sure that they've calculated that right, the vote's going to go your way, and it's going to be the best outcome for everyone. Now they've learned they not only can't trust his judgment, but a three-line whip, which is what we in Westminster refer to as the absolute, most underlined, you have to vote this way and you cannot miss it vote, has been completely smashed to pieces as a concept, because they've just discovered that all you need is, 50 rebellions and active abstentions, and you can force the government's hand to U-turn on the policy. It's undermined Boris's 80-seat majority quite spectacularly.
It's interesting, the Conservatives used to sort of stand on the ladies not for turning. They used to be that party of principle, and they may do unpopular things, but they said that the medicine was worth it. This seems to be a very different sort of Conservative party. This seems to be a Conservative party that's almost addicted to U-turning, that's following the focus groups, that's following the polls. And I've spoken to cabinet ministers who say that shows that it's a government who's listening, that it's responsive to how the public feel. But ultimately, are U-turns actually at all a benefit for this government?
I find the amount of U-turns very interesting, because I think for those of us in the eye of the storm, in the Westminster bubble, they can seem quite farcical, and they can seem a much bigger deal than the amount that actually cut through to the public. And I think around the time of the last few U-turns, there was some analysis that basically showed that in the end, on balance, a government U-turn is beneficial, because the public just generally appreciate the end result rather than forcing through an unpopular policy for the sake of it. The problem is, if you do U-turn after U-turn after U-turn, you then have to start asking, well, what does this government believe? Cabinet ministers might spin the amount of U-turns and poll following as a good thing, but ultimately, You know, a government is meant to lead public opinion, not follow it. And I think that, you know, Maggie, or indeed, you know, thinking back to the broadly unpopular at the time austerity measures of the Cameron government, you know, they had to lead public opinion. And ultimately, for David Cameron, that worked because he won in 2015, even though throughout the 5-year term, what they were doing was seemingly unpopular. And people respect a strong-headedness. And, you know, Boris is a person who likes being popular, but if following opinion always means being behind the curve and not being respected as a strong leader, then you undermine that.
Yeah, you look like a follower, not a leader. That, I suppose, is the danger of this government. Christian Calgi, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really interesting analysis there. Well, one other issue that actually isn't being picked up enough in the rest of the media is, of course, COVID. Now, there have been some people who've called COVID correctly and some people who've got their predictions disastrously wrong. One person who was less than accurate at the start of the summer was the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Lifting all restrictions in one go is reckless. And doing so when the Johnson variant is clearly out of control risks a summer of chaos. We're heading now for an NHS summer crisis. We will always support jobs and livelihoods, but Johnson's recklessness risks plunging us back into restrictions again. This will not be Freedom Day for the 100,000 people per day catching COVID and the millions more being asked to isolate. The government has once again lost control of the virus and lost public trust in its messaging. They need to think again on their reckless plan before it's too late.
Sir Keir Starmer there on the 19th of July this summer, ahead of Freedom Day, predicting a summer NHS crisis and 100,000 COVID cases a day. Well, what actually happened? Here is a graph showing the case numbers, and almost as soon as Keir Starmer published those words, cases began to fall off a cliff. Indeed, cases have never reached 100,000 a day. Even the most recent little rise was not as high as that rise that was going on at the beginning of July. Cases have now been falling for more than 2 weeks, not getting anywhere close to 100,000, heading down to 30,000 a day. Well, it's not just Keir Starmer that's been confused with COVID. Last week, Sky News reported a new React-1 study, trying to suggest that this study showed that the prevalence of COVID, that the number of new cases was the highest it had ever been. This was their headline. Sky News said that infections at highest ever recorded level, referring, of course, to that React-1 study. Well, let's look at the actual study. Let's look at what the actual study showed. On page 20 of the study, no less, it shows the peak came around the 20th of October, that cases had been falling since then. Cases had been falling since the 20th of October, the precise opposite to the impression that was given by that Sky News article. In fact, it's worth dwelling on what cases have been doing for over 2 weeks now in all age categories. The mathematician James Ward has produced some really useful case ratio graphs where we can see the weekly case ratio, or see if cases are rising or if they're falling. We can track patterns and how fast cases are rising or falling. And here we can see every age group is seeing falls. Every age group is below that line, seeing those cases fall down. In this next graph, we can see that older age groups having the biggest falls. The boosters are clearly working. All of those falls down and down and down. At the middle age groups, we can see negative growth as well. And even in the youngest, we're seeing the same direction. It's only the 0 to 4-year-old age category that's slightly above that line, but it's heading down to, no doubt, will very soon be seeing negative growth as well. Well, that is the real picture. I do wish that more organisations would report it when cases go down as well as when they go up. And it looks like we're heading for some good news with COVID. Well, that's it from me this morning. Thank you for watching The Briefing. I'll be back again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. But up next, it's To The Point with Patrick Christys and Mercy Moroki. So stick around for that after your weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that